There is a place in southern England where, if you stand in the right field at the right hour of morning, just as the first grey light begins to separate the land from the sky, you can feel the weight of something ancient pressing upward through the soil beneath your feet. The chalk is close to the surface here. The grass grows thin and pale over it, and on certain mornings in certain seasons, where the dew has settled unevenly across the ground, you can see the ghost lines of things buried below. A slight depression, too long and too straight to be natural. A gentle ridge, barely raised above the surrounding field, running for several hundred meters before dissolving back into the ordinary landscape. These are the shadows of a world that was already ancient when the first stone of Stonehenge was raised. They are not dramatic. They do not announce themselves. They simply wait, as the dead have always waited, for someone willing to slow down enough to notice. Most people, when they think of prehistoric Britain, think of Stonehenge. That is where the story seems to start for most of us. Those great grey sarcens standing on the Salisbury Plain, the lintels locked in place overhead, the whole arrangement oriented to the midsummer sunrise with such precision that the intention is unmistakable. That is the image that comes first. That is what we have been given as the beginning. But Stonehenge is not the beginning. Stonehenge is almost the end of something, not the start of it. By the time the first trilithons were raised into the arrangement we recognize today, British prehistory had already been accumulating for 5,000 years. 5,000 years of people living on this land. 5,000 years of culture and memory and monument building and ceremony and trade and conflict and loss. 5,000 years that most people have never heard spoken aloud, because this period has no written record, no named rulers, no famous battles that schoolchildren are made to memorize, no single dramatic moment that history teachers can point to and say, "Here, this is where it started. It started long before that." And tonight, we are going back to the very beginning of it. If this is your first time here, welcome to History for Sleep. Subscribe and settle in, because tonight we are traveling a very long way. Find your comfortable position, let the weight of the day begin to leave your body, and allow this story to unfold at the pace it needs to. There is no urgency in what follows. The people we are going to talk about tonight have been waiting thousands of years to be heard. They can wait a little longer while you get comfortable. And if sleep finds you somewhere in the middle of all this, that is perfectly fine. That is what we are here for. The story will still be here when you come back. Before Britain was an island, it was a peninsula. This is one of those facts that once you really sit with it and allow it to settle fully into your understanding, begins to change everything about how you imagine prehistoric Europe. The familiar shape of the British Isles, that particular silhouette tucked against the northwestern edge of the continental shelf, surrounded by water on all sides, defined in many ways by its very separateness from the landmass to the east and south, did not exist in the form we know it. 10,000 years ago, 12,000 years ago, the picture was entirely different. Where the North Sea lies today, there was land. Where the English Channel cuts between Dover and Calais, there was a broad river valley, grassy and slow-moving, fed by tributaries draining from what would eventually become the chalk cliffs of southern England and the flat plains of northern France. Britain was not separate. Britain was a peninsula attached to continental Europe, and the land that connected it was vast and rich and inhabited by thousands of people who had no reason to believe it would ever be otherwise. Geologists and archaeologists call this lost territory Doggerland, a name taken from the Dogger Bank, the shallow underwater ridge in the central North Sea, where fishing trawlers have for centuries been pulling up objects that do not belong in seawater. Mammoth bones, still recognizable despite their millennia of immersion. The antlers of red deer, enormous and branching, still carrying the marks of the animal's growth rings. Worked flint tools, clearly shaped by human hands with intention and skill. Fragments of peat, the compressed organic residue of the land surface that once existed there, the soil and roots and plant matter of a country that the sea has swallowed. Lumps of what is called moorlog, a dark material formed from the compressed remains of ancient fen vegetation, sometimes yielding within them seeds and pollen, and the microscopic evidence of plants that grew in Doggerland when it was still above water. Each of these objects hauled up in a fishing net is a piece of evidence for the same conclusion. Beneath the North Sea, there is a drowned country, and it was once home to people who knew it as well as any of us know the land we grew up on. The extent of Doggerland at its maximum, during the coldest phases of the last ice age, when sea levels were at their lowest because enormous quantities of water were locked up in the polar ice sheets, was extraordinary. It stretched from the current eastern coast of Britain all the way across to what is now the coast of Scandinavia and the Netherlands. It was not a narrow causeway or a thin land bridge in the limited sense that phrase sometimes implies. It was a genuine landmass, hundreds of miles across in places, with hills and river valleys, with wetlands and coastal marshes and estuaries, with forests on the higher ground and open grassland in the drier inland zones, and with all the ecological variety that a territory of that size and that geography would naturally support. Estimates of its area at its largest extent suggest something comparable to the modern landmass of Great Britain itself, and possibly considerably larger. It was a country, by any reasonable definition of the word. It had its own climate, its own rivers, its own animal populations, its own human communities. And for the people who lived in it, it was simply home. The people who lived in Doggerland were hunter-gatherers. They belonged to the broad cultural tradition that archaeologists call the Mesolithic, the Middle Stone Age, and they were not primitive in any sense that the word usually implies. They were modern humans, anatomically identical to us in every biological respect, with the same capacity for language and memory and planning and emotional complexity and social organization and cultural creativity. They had developed over tens of thousands of years the knowledge and skill and accumulated wisdom that sustained life in the varied landscapes of northwestern Europe. And Doggerland, with its abundance of fish and waterfowl and red deer and wild boar and aurochs and the edible plants of the wetland margins, would have been exceptionally good country to live in. Wetland environments in particular, where fresh water meets brackish water, where reed beds give way to open water and then to dry ground, where the seasons bring different animals and different plant foods in reliable succession, are among the most productive and easiest to live in of any ecological zone on Earth. The people of Doggerland knew every corner of this landscape with the intimate, detailed, multi-generational knowledge that only comes from living in a place for a very long time. What we know of these people comes almost entirely from the objects they left behind, the objects that the cold anaerobic conditions of the seabed have preserved, and that fishing activities have occasionally disturbed and brought back to the surface. From these fragments, archaeologists have been able to reconstruct something of the picture. The flint tools are the most common finds, scrapers and blades, and what are called microliths, small carefully worked flint pieces that were set into wooden or bone handles to create composite tools, knives and arrows and spears whose wooden components have long since rotted away, but whose existence is implied by the careful sizing and shaping of the stone elements. The antler tools and bone harpoon heads, the barbed pieces designed for fishing or for hunting deer and elk, tell us about the animals they pursued and the methods they used. The peat and the moorlog samples, when subjected to analysis for preserved pollen and plant remains, tell us about the landscape they moved through, a landscape of birch woodland and pine and hazel thicket, of open sedge marsh and reed bed, of brown rivers running through flat floodplains, of estuary and mudflat and sheltered bay at the margins where the land met the sea. One object recovered from the North Sea has become particularly associated with the story of Doggerland and with the human reality of what was eventually lost there. In 1931, a fishing vessel called the Kalinda was trawling in the southern North Sea in an area known as the Leman and Oa Banks, when its nets brought up a lump of peat from the seabed, approximately 35 meters below the surface. Inside the peat, when a crew member broke it open, was a piece of antler bone, 21 centimeters in length, barbed along one edge with a series of small but precisely worked pointed projections. It had been deliberately shaped, transformed from raw material into a tool or weapon by the careful, patient work of a human hand. The hand that shaped it belonged to someone who lived in Doggerland approximately 11,500 years ago, in the earliest centuries of the Mesolithic period. The Kalinda Antler Point, as it came to be known, is now in the collection of the Castle Museum in Norwich. It is one of the most haunting objects in British prehistory, because it is so clearly and so movingly the product of skill and intention and purpose, so unmistakably something made by a thinking, planning person for a specific reason, and it comes from a world that no longer exists. Whoever made it caught food with it, or hunted with it, or both, and then at some point it was lost, or discarded, or deliberately deposited in the wetland where the peat eventually formed around it. The person who made it has been beneath the sea for 11,500 years. Their tool surfaced for the first time since their own lifetime in the hold of a fishing vessel in 1931. There have been many other finds since then, and the work of reconstructing the landscape and the life of Doggerland has become increasingly sophisticated as technology has improved. The development of techniques for processing seabed sediment cores, and especially the adaptation for archaeological purposes of seismic survey data originally gathered by the oil and gas industry to map the geology of the North Sea basin, has allowed researchers to build increasingly detailed pictures of what Doggerland looked like at various periods in its existence. There is an area in what is now the southern North Sea, whose seabed topography, when the sediments are mapped and the ancient land surface is reconstructed from the data, reveals a landscape of low hill country surrounded by river valleys and wetland plains. This feature, which researchers have informally called the Dogger Hills after the bank that represents their submerged summits, may have been a particularly significant area of human settlement in the later centuries of Doggerland's existence, when rising sea levels had already reduced the territory considerably, and its remaining population may have been concentrating on the higher ground, still above the waterline. It is a melancholy thought, a community living on a shrinking island, watching the water rise generation by generation, retreating further and further onto the high ground until the high ground, too, was gone. Because the sea was rising, slowly at first, in the centuries immediately following the peak of the last ice age, and then faster. The process that would eventually submerge Doggerland entirely had begun roughly 20,000 years ago, as the ice sheets covering northern Europe and North America began their long retreat, melting and returning their water to the oceans in a process that raised global sea levels by more than 100 meters over the subsequent 12,000 years. The rise was not continuous or perfectly smooth. There were periods when it slowed or even paused, associated with temporary reversals in the warming trend, and there were periods when it accelerated sharply as particular ice sheet dynamics drove pulses of meltwater into the ocean. But the overall trend was relentless, and on any human timescale, it was dramatic. Coastlines that had been stable for the lifetime of a community would have shifted measurably within a generation. River valleys that had been dry land would have become estuaries. Hills that had stood above the floodplain would have become islands. The geography of the world that people had known and named and built their lives around was changing, and there was nothing to be done about it except to move. The people of Doggerland moved. Gradually, over generations, the population that had inhabited this vast lowland territory retreated to higher ground. Some went north and east into what is now Scandinavia. Some went south and east into what is now France and the Low Countries and Germany. And some went west onto the higher chalk and limestone uplands of what would eventually become Britain. They brought with them their knowledge, their tools, their traditions, their understanding of the landscape and the animals and the seasons and the stars. They brought with them the accumulated cultural inheritance of tens of thousands of years of life in northwestern Europe. They came to Britain not as strangers or invaders, but as people continuing to live in their world, a world that happened to be shrinking, moving, dissolving beneath the cold grey water behind them. The shore was retreating, the people followed the high ground, and the world they left behind sank below the waves, slowly and then all at once, and it was gone. The oldest complete human face we can put to British prehistory belongs to a man from the southwest of England. He was found in 1903 in a cave called Gough's Cave, in the dramatic limestone gorge at Cheddar in Somerset, buried in the deposits of the cave floor, along with the bones of animals and the evidence of many earlier occupations, stretching back into the Paleolithic, the Old Stone Age. The skeleton is largely complete, and the radiocarbon dates obtained from it place his death at approximately 10,200 years before the present, which puts him right at the beginning of the Mesolithic period in Britain. He has become known as Cheddar Man, and he is the oldest complete human skeleton ever found in the British Isles. What made Cheddar Man scientifically remarkable for most of the century after his discovery was principally his age and his completeness. He became a fixture of natural history museum displays and educational materials, standing in as a representative of the ancient Britain, and the image typically associated with him was, for most of that century, simply the generic image of a prehistoric northern European. Light-skinned, dark-haired, rather unremarkable in appearance. Then, in 2018, a team of researchers from University College London and the Natural History Museum succeeded in extracting and sequencing ancient DNA from the petrous bone of his skull, the dense bone of the inner ear that tends to preserve genetic material better than any other part of the skeleton because of the very high mineral density of the tissue. And the picture that emerged from that analysis was entirely different from the one that had been assumed for 115 years. Cheddar Man had dark skin. Not moderately dark or ambiguously olive, but genetically predicted to have been dark to very dark in pigmentation. He had blue or green eyes, he had dark curly hair. The combination is arresting to modern eyes because we are so thoroughly accustomed to thinking of blue eyes as belonging with pale skin. But in the early Mesolithic, the genetic variants that produce light skin pigmentation in modern northern European populations had not yet spread through the gene pool to any significant degree. The early inhabitants of Britain were dark-skinned people with light-coloured eyes, and they had been living on this island, or on the landmass that would become this island, for thousands of years before any notion of a pale-skinned English person had any biological basis. The pale skin, the reddishness, the tendency to freckle that we now associate with certain types of British complexion are not ancient indigenous characteristics of the island's founding population. They are developments that arrived later, through the gradual spread of different genetic variants through the population and through the arrival of new peoples carrying those variants in higher frequencies. Cheddar Man reminds us, in the clearest possible terms, that our assumptions about what ancient Britons looked like are built on a very recent and not very well-examined foundation. Beyond the genetics, the physical condition of Cheddar Man's skeleton tells us something about the life he lived. He was in his 20s when he died, which in the Mesolithic was not necessarily exceptionally young. The idea that prehistoric life expectancy was uniformly short is a simplification, and many individuals did survive into their 40s and 50s. But reaching old age was genuinely difficult, and death in the earlier decades of life was common for reasons ranging from injury to infection to the simple cumulative toll of physical labor in a demanding environment. His skull shows evidence of what may be a healed blow to the head, though whether this represents an injury that contributed to his death or one that he survived is not determinable from the bone alone. His teeth are well preserved and tell their own story. Heavy wear consistent with a diet of tough and fibrous foods, with the use of the teeth as tools for gripping and processing materials other than food, as Mesolithic people very commonly did. No cavities, consistent with the low-sugar diet of a hunter-gatherer, and the kind of general robustness to the skeleton that speaks of regular, demanding physical activity from an early age. The cave he was found in had been occupied, on and off, for a very long time before Cheddarman's generation came to use it. The deeper deposits in Gough's cave contain material from the Upper Paleolithic, the period before the last glacial maximum, and among the objects recovered from these older layers are some of the most extraordinary and deeply troubling finds in the entire history of British archaeology. Human bones bearing the cut marks of flint tools, careful, deliberate defleshing marks, the same kind of marks that appear on animal bones when they are being butchered for consumption, and in at least one case, a human skull that had been carefully and painstakingly worked into the shape of a vessel, a cup or bowl, with the rough edges trimmed away and the interior smoothed. The evidence for the consumption of human flesh in Gough's cave during the Paleolithic period is strong and has been accepted by the majority of researchers who have examined it carefully. Whatever the people who made those cups from human skulls believed that they were doing it in the same cave where Cheddarman would later be laid to rest, and the deep continuity of human use of that specific place across thousands of years is itself one of the most striking things the site reveals. Gough's cave is one site among many where the earliest Mesolithic inhabitants of Britain have left their traces. At Aveline's Hole, less than a kilometre away in the same gorge, a burial site dating to roughly the same period contained the remains of at least 50 individuals deposited in the cave over what appears to have been an extended period of use. The site was badly disturbed by enthusiastic but careless 19th century investigators before systematic archaeological methods were applied, and much information has been permanently lost. But what remains confirms that the early Mesolithic people of Britain were returning to specific locations repeatedly and intentionally for the purpose of depositing their dead. These were not random acts. They were the expression of a relationship between living communities and the specific places in the landscape that held their ancestors, places that were significant precisely because the dead were there, and because returning to those places was a way of maintaining the connection between the living generations and all the generations that had come before. These places of the dead were not isolated from the rest of life. They were embedded in territories that living communities moved through, used and understood as their own. The cave at Cheddar was a place to shelter in winter, to butcher animals, to make tools and prepare food, and also, in some specific way, a place where the dead were brought and cared for. The distinction between the sacred and the everyday that we are inclined to draw was perhaps not meaningful in the same way to people for whom the dead were simply the previous generation of the same ongoing community, present in a different form, but not removed to a separate realm. If Cheddarman gives us a face and a genetic profile, a site called Starcar in North Yorkshire gives us something more intimate still, a window into the actual texture of daily life in early Mesolithic Britain, the objects and choices and small decisions that made up the existence of people who left no words behind. Starcar sits in what is now the flat, drained farmland of the Vale of Pickering, a broad, shallow depression in the Yorkshire landscape that was, 10,500 years ago, the reed-fringed edge of a large and shallow lake. The lake no longer exists. The valley floor has been agriculturally managed and drained for centuries, and for most of the year, the surface gives no hint of what lies beneath. But the waterlogged conditions that have persisted in the valley floor for much of the intervening time have preserved organic materials, wood and bone and plant remains and worked antler, that would in drier conditions have rotted entirely within decades of their deposition. From this accidental preservation comes one of the richest and most informative Mesolithic sites anywhere in all of Europe. Starcar was first systematically excavated in the late 1940s and early 1950s by the Cambridge archaeologist Graham Clark, whose work there became one of the defining achievements of British prehistoric archaeology in the 20th century. Clark's team moved carefully through the peat and waterlogged lake deposits at what had been the ancient shoreline and found a remarkable and varied collection of preserved material. There were platforms of brushwood and timber at the water's edge, deliberately constructed rather than naturally accumulated, suggesting that the people who used this site had created some form of raised or stable working surface at the lake margin. There were rolls of birch bark, apparently collected and set aside as raw material, perhaps for use as kindling or for making containers or for waterproofing. There were antler tools and bone points and worked flint in quantities substantial enough to make clear that this site was not a single brief encampment, but a place used repeatedly and over an extended period of time. And then there were the headdresses, which remain among the most haunting and thought-provoking objects from any Mesolithic site in Britain. Among Clark's finds were 21 pieces of red deer, frontlet, sections of deer skull retaining the base of the antlers, each carefully modified to be worn on a human head. The preparation of these pieces was skilled and time-consuming. The skin and brain tissue had been removed. The bone had been thinned, in many cases quite dramatically, to reduce the weight of the piece to something that could be worn comfortably for extended periods. In some frontlets, small holes had been bored through the base, possibly for attachment to a cap or a binding of some kind. The antlers on each piece were left intact, so that whoever wore it would, from the front and from a distance, have appeared to carry the antlers of a deer on their own head. The effect, even now when you see reconstructions of these objects in museums, is striking and strange and oddly moving. The interpretation of these objects is, and will probably always remain, uncertain. The most commonly offered explanations divide broadly between ritual and practical. In the ritual interpretation, the frontlets were worn by spiritual specialists, shamans, or equivalent figures during ceremonies that involved the adoption of the identity or qualities of the deer, ceremonies of healing or of communication with other than human beings, or of the marking of important transitions in the social or seasonal calendar. In the practical interpretation, they were hunting disguises, used to approach deer at close quarters by mimicking the appearance of the herd. Both interpretations are plausible, and they are not mutually exclusive. In many hunting societies around the world, the distinction between hunting magic and practical hunting technique is not a distinction that the hunters themselves would recognize, because the success of the hunt is understood to depend on both the physical skill of the hunter and the proper maintenance of the relationship between humans and the animals they hunt. What is beyond doubt is the care and skill that went into making each frontlet, and the fact that 21 of them were found at a single site suggests that the people who gathered here were involved in activities that required this kind of equipment on a regular and significant basis. Starcar also produced the oldest known wooden structure in Britain, a platform or trackway of worked timber at the lake's edge, dated to the very beginning of the Mesolithic occupation of the site. The existence of deliberately worked timber in this context implies a repertoire of woodworking skills that we often do not associate with Stone Age people, and it implies purpose. People were constructing this platform for a specific reason, to provide stable footing at the lake margin, perhaps for fishing, perhaps for the launching of boats. And it implies boats. A lake this size and this rich in fish and waterfowl would have been most productively exploited from the water rather than from the shore alone. And the wooden paddle that was also recovered from the waterlogged deposits. The oldest known boat-related wooden object in Britain confirms that water travel was part of life at Starkar. More recent work at Starkar, conducted in the early 21st century by a consortium of researchers, has added substantially to what Clark found and has, in some respects, transformed our understanding of the site. The new excavations found evidence of a large rectangular building, approximately 11 meters long and 5 meters wide, constructed of timber posts set into the ground in a pattern clear enough to allow the structure's plan to be recovered, even though the posts themselves had long since decayed. This is the oldest known building in Britain. It predates the Neolithic longhouses of the farming period by thousands of years. Someone at Starkar, 10,500 years ago, built a house. Not a windbreak or a rough shelter. A house, planned, with a defined interior space, presumably with walls and a roof designed to be inhabited across multiple seasons or multiple years. The existence of this building changes, in quite a fundamental way, the picture of Mesolithic life as inherently mobile and provisional. The more recent work also revealed evidence of catastrophic fire at Starkar, with deposits of burned material spread across a wide area of the site, apparently representing the burning of the wooden platform and associated structures. After this burning, the site was reoccupied. New platforms were built. People returned and continued to use this place, apparently across several centuries in total. The attachment to Starkar, the repeated return across what may have been lifetimes and generations, speaks to a sense of place that we do not often attribute to mobile hunter-gatherers, but that the evidence here strongly implies. To understand the world that these people moved through, you have to understand the forest. From approximately 10,000 years ago, following the end of the glaciation and the general warming that accompanied it, the British landscape underwent one of the most dramatic transformations in its recent geological history. The open tundra and grassland and shrubby heath that had characterized much of the island during the coldest phases of the Ice Age gave way, in the warmer and wetter conditions of the early Holocene, to forest. Not the managed, cropped, ride-crossed woodland that survives in fragments across the modern British countryside, full of daylight and paths and the distant sound of roads. Dense, tall, continuous, ancient forest, of the kind that almost no one alive today has ever experienced, because virtually none of it survives anywhere in Europe. The succession that produced this forest followed a predictable ecological pattern. Birch came first, the pioneer, lightweight and wind-dispersed, tolerant of poor soils and marginal conditions, spreading rapidly across the newly available land as the retreating ice left bare ground in its wake. Hazel followed close behind, filling the understory with its arching stems and abundant nuts, and creating the kind of dense, browse-rich shrub layer that deer and boar find attractive. Then, as the soil developed and deepened, came the great canopy trees. In the south and east, oak and ash and elm, with small-leaved lime in the warmer valleys and on the better soils, creating a dense and layered canopy that let very little light through to the floor beneath. In the north and west and on the higher ground, pine persisted, where the soils were thinner and the conditions more exposed, giving way to birch woodland on the moorland edges and to open ground on the highest summits. By the time the Mesolithic was well established, somewhere between 9,000 and 8,000 years ago, the wildwood had closed in across most of Britain below the high uplands. This forest was wild in the strictest sense of the word, entirely unmanaged by human activity, organized by its own internal ecological logic, shaped by relationships between species that had been developing over millennia. It was home to animals that have long since been extirpated from Britain. The aurochs, the massive wild ancestor of domestic cattle, stood nearly 2 meters at the shoulder and carried horns that could span 3 feet from tip to tip, and it grazed the forest clearings and the open floodplain edges in herds that left their marks in the pollen record as patches of disturbed and grazed ground. The elk, taller even than the aurochs at the shoulder, moved through the wetland edges and the floodplain forests on its broad splayed hooves. Brown bears denned in the chalk caves and the rocky northern uplands. Wolves hunted in the forests in family groups, following the deer herds through the seasons. Lynx stalked the woodland floor in near silence. Wild boar rooted through the deep leaf litter of the old oak woods, turning the soil and opening small disturbances that provided the conditions for a succession of other species to exploit. Beavers dammed the smaller streams and created the ponds and marshy ground that the waterfowl and the wetland plants and the human communities that followed the food all depended on. The Mesolithic people, who lived in this wildwood, were part of it, integrated into its ecology in the way that any predator species is part of its ecosystem, dependent on it for everything they needed, shaping it through their presence, shaped in turn by its demands and its rhythms. They moved through the forest following the movements of the animals and the ripening of the plant foods across the seasons, returning to favored locations at the appropriate times of year, carrying with them the accumulated knowledge of how this specific landscape worked that had been built up over generations of observation and experience. They knew where the hazelnuts were densest in autumn, and they came back to the same groves year after year to harvest them and store them for winter. They knew where the deer concentrated in the rut, and they planned around that knowledge. They knew the rivers where the fish ran in spring, and the bogs where the cranberries ripened in late summer, and the cliff faces where the pigeons nested. This knowledge was not written down. It was held in memory and passed on through practice, through the teaching of children who went everywhere with the adults and learned by doing. The wildwood was not simply a resource to be exploited. The evidence from pollen sequences preserved in lake sediments and peat bogs across Britain shows, with increasing clarity as more sites are analysed, that the Mesolithic people were actively managing their environment. The signature of this management appears in the pollen record as sudden localised declines in tree pollen, particularly elm, accompanied by increases in the pollen of weedy and open ground plants that prefer disturbed soil. Plantain, bracken, sorrel, the plants that colonize ground that has been opened up by fire or cutting. These events occur at multiple sites and at multiple points through the Mesolithic period, and they look very much like the fingerprints of deliberate burning. People setting fire to sections of the wildwood, creating clearings that encouraged the growth of the shrubby browse that attracted deer, opening up hunting grounds, improving the conditions for the plants they found most useful. The Mesolithic people of Britain were not simply living in the wildwood, they were managing it, year by year and generation by generation, and the landscape they passed on to those who came after them was already, in its subtle ways, a human landscape. The seasons shaped everything in the wildwood world. Spring brought the return of migratory birds to the wetlands, the new growth of plants after winter, the birth of deer calves and other young animals in the woodland margins. Summer brought abundance of plant food, the long evenings that permitted extended activity, the warming of rivers and lakes that concentrated fish in particular ways. Autumn was the time of greatest plenty, the harvest of nuts and berries and fungi, the fattening of animals before winter, the critical period when enough had to be gathered and stored to sustain the community through the months of cold. Winter was the lean time, when Stored food and hunting skill, and the knowledge of where to find the things that remained available in the cold months made the difference between survival and death. The Mesolithic year was a rhythm as reliable as breathing, and people organized their lives around it as naturally as they organized their lives around the rising and setting of the sun. The world of Doggerland ended gradually, and then, according to some of the geological evidence, with a sudden and catastrophic event. The gradual part was the steady rise of sea levels that had been proceeding since the end of the last ice age. The slow encroachment of the sea across the lowlands of the North Sea basin that had been compressing the habitable territory of Doggerland for thousands of years. The catastrophic part is associated with an event that took place approximately 8,150 years ago, and the physical evidence for it can be found preserved in coastal sediment sequences from Norway all the way around to the eastern coasts of Scotland and northern England. A distinctive deposit of sand and shell and disturbed organic material that geologists call the Storegga Slide deposit. The Storegga Slide was one of the largest underwater landslides in recorded geological history. It occurred on the continental shelf off the coast of what is now Norway, where an enormous mass of sediment had been accumulating since the end of the last ice age, building up unstably on the steep slope of the continental margin. When this mass finally lost cohesion and failed, it slid down the continental slope into the deep ocean in one catastrophic movement. The volume of material involved was comparable in scale to the entire landmass of Iceland, and the displacement of water generated by its collapse sent a wave outward in all directions from the site. That wave was a tsunami, and it was not like the swells and surges that most people associate with storm waves. It was a wall of water generated by the sudden displacement of an enormous volume of ocean, and its height when it reached the coasts of Scotland and northeastern England, based on the deposit it left behind and on the modelling of its propagation through the shallow water of the North Sea basin, was somewhere between 10 and 20 metres in places, with lower but still devastating effects over a much wider area. In the lower-lying terrain of Doggerland, which at this point in its history had already been substantially reduced and fragmented by centuries of sea level rise, the Storegga tsunami would have been devastating. Low islands and wetland peninsulas that had still been habitable would have been overwhelmed. Communities settled on ground only a few meters above the contemporary sea level would have had no warning and no escape. The human cost of this event, across a landscape that had been inhabited for thousands of years, must have been severe, and the population of Mesolithic Britain shows, in its ancient DNA record, evidence of a bottleneck, a reduction in genetic diversity consistent with a significant and sudden reduction in population size, followed by subsequent recovery. The timing of this bottleneck is approximately consistent with the Storegga event and with the period of maximum sea level rise. The oral traditions of peoples around the world include stories of floods, of the sea rising and taking the land, of worlds drowned beneath the water. Whether any of these stories can be traced in a direct, unbroken line of transmission back to specific events, like the inundation of Doggerland, is something that will probably never be provable. But the impulse to remember and to tell, to make narrative from catastrophe, to pass the story of what was lost onto the children and the grandchildren, so that the knowledge would not be lost with the people who witnessed it, that impulse belongs to human nature as surely as the capacity for language itself. The people who watched the water come, who carried what they could and moved to the higher ground, who looked back from the chalk ridges and the limestone hills at the flat country filling slowly with grey northern sea, would have talked about it. They would have told the story for as long as anyone was alive who had seen it or heard of it from someone who had. The words are beyond recovery. The experience they described is not difficult to imagine. By around 6,000 years before the present, Britain was an island. The low-lying land connections to continental Europe had been submerged. The English Channel existed as a body of water, The North Sea existed as a sea, the world of Doggerland was gone, and the people who had moved on to the higher ground were now living on an island, which is a different kind of experience entirely. Islands are bounded. Islands create the conditions for distinctiveness, for the development of cultures that grow apart from those of the surrounding landmass. Britain's insularity, its tendency across much of its history to be simultaneously connected to and separate from the rest of Europe, begins here in the gradual separation of a peninsula from a continent. Around 6,000 years ago, something began that changed Britain in ways still visible in the landscape today. It arrived from the continent, crossing the channel in boats, and it was not a dramatic conquest or a sudden violent replacement of one way of life by another. It was a transformation of everything, the idea and practice of farming. The Neolithic Revolution had begun in the Near East approximately 10,000 years ago, in the river valleys and upland margins of what is now Turkey and Syria and Iraq, where people had first begun deliberately cultivating wild grasses and managing wild animals in ways that would eventually produce the crops and domestic animals that now feed most of the world. From that original center of innovation, farming had spread slowly and unevenly across Europe over the following several thousand years, carried by people who were themselves moving westward and northward. By around 4000 BCE, it had reached Britain. The ancient DNA evidence for what happened at this transition is among the most striking findings of the entire ancient genomics revolution. Between approximately 4000 and 3500 BCE, the genetic character of the British population was transformed with a speed and completeness that leaves very little room for ambiguity. The Western hunter-gatherer ancestry that had characterized Mesolithic Britain was replaced to a degree of more than 90% in most sampled individuals from Neolithic Britain by an ancestry associated with the early European farmers. People ultimately descended from the Anatolian populations who had been the originators of European agriculture and whose descendants had been spreading westward across the continent for several thousand years before they reached Britain. Within a few centuries of the first farming communities arriving in Britain, the Mesolithic population had been overwhelmed genetically. The newcomers were not a small group of agricultural pioneers, slowly teaching their skills to the existing population. They were a mass migration, and the population they displaced left almost no genetic trace. The most likely mechanism for a replacement of this speed and completeness is disease. The farming populations of Europe had spent thousands of years in close daily contact with domestic animals, particularly cattle and sheep and pigs, and from that proximity they had acquired, at terrible cost in epidemic mortality through their own history, immunity or partial immunity to a range of infectious diseases that had originally crossed the species barrier from animals to humans. The Mesolithic hunter-gatherers of Britain had no such immunological history, and when they encountered the disease pool carried by the incoming farming communities, the result would have been catastrophic. The detailed history of every documented contact between farming populations and hunter-gatherer populations in the historical record is a history of demographic devastation among the latter, and there is no particular reason to think that what happened in Neolithic Britain was different in its broad outlines. The world that the Neolithic farmers built in Britain was different from the Mesolithic world in ways that went beyond the obvious practical differences of growing grain and herding cattle. The Neolithic way of life was a different relationship with the land in its most fundamental sense. Farmers stay in one place. They invest their labor in a specific piece of ground. They clear it, break it, plant it, tend it, harvest it, and return to do it all again. That investment creates attachment, and attachment creates a relationship with place that is qualitatively different from anything available to people who move through the landscape. The field that your grandparents cleared is your field. The ancestors who worked it are part of the landscape, in a way that makes them present in the daily act of farming. And it is from this deep, rooted, generational attachment to specific places that the Neolithic monuments emerge, from the need to mark the land as belonging to a community, to root the community in the land through the presence of its dead, to make visible and permanent the investment of generations in a particular piece of ground. The Long Barrows are the oldest monumental structures in Britain, older than Stonehenge by 2,000 years or more, and they are the most direct expression of the relationship that early Neolithic people maintained with their dead. They are found across southern and central Britain, from the chalk downs of Wiltshire and Dorset through the limestone hills of the Cotswolds and into the Welsh marches and the limestone uplands of northern England. More than 500 have been identified, and there are certainly more that have been destroyed by centuries of agriculture or have simply never been found beneath the modern landscape. Each one is a mound of earth and chalk, rubble and stone, elongated in plan, raised above the surrounding ground to a degree that varies from site to site, but that was always sufficient to be visible across the open downland from a considerable distance. They are not enormous structures. The largest are perhaps 100 meters in length and 4 or 5 meters high at their greatest point. But they have endured for 5,500 years without being maintained, which is in itself a remarkable statement about the durability of simple earthen and stone construction when the underlying engineering is sound. Inside many of these mounds, though not in all of them, there are chambers, rooms of stone, built in a variety of architectural traditions that reflect regional variations in available materials and presumably in cultural preferences. In the Cotswolds tradition, the chambers are often made of the local Oolitic limestone, built with dry stone walling and corbelled roofing to create roughly oval or circular interior spaces. In other regions, the chambers are built of the large sarsen or granite boulders that occur naturally in the landscape, with massive upright stones supporting enormous capstones laid horizontally across the top. The building technique varies, but the purpose is consistent: to create an enclosed stone space within the body of the mound, accessible by a passage from the outside and intended for the deposition of human remains. Entering one of those chambers that remains accessible today is an experience that is difficult to describe without resorting to the word atmosphere, which does not quite capture the quality of what you encounter. To enter the chamber at West Kennet Long Barrow in Wiltshire, which is one of the longest and most impressive of its type, you must crouch and move through a low stone-lined entrance passage, perhaps 15 meters in length, before you reach the central passage and the side chambers that open off it. The chambers are not spacious. The ceiling is at most 2 meters above the floor, and in many places lower. The walls press close on both sides. The light from outside fades quickly in the passage, and in the deeper chambers is entirely absent. It is cool in there even on a warm summer day, and quiet in a way that is different from ordinary quiet. The kind of quiet that comes from enclosure in stone and earth that absorbs sound rather than reflecting it. It is not an uncomfortable space, exactly, but it is not a space designed for human comfort. It was designed for the dead. And the dead were brought here in great numbers, and over a great span of time. At West Kennet, the remains of at least 46 individuals were deposited in the chambers over a period that the radiocarbon dates suggest extended across several centuries. These individuals were not all buried at the same time or in the same way. The evidence from the bone deposits shows that bodies were brought to the monument at different points in time, that some were already skeletal when they arrived, perhaps having been laid out elsewhere to decompose before being gathered and brought to the chamber, and that the bones of different individuals were regularly mixed, sorted, and rearranged over the monument's period of use. Skulls and long bones were sometimes separated from the rest of the skeleton and placed in specific positions. The remains of many individuals were intermingled in ways that would make it impossible, once the chamber was finally sealed, to identify which bones belonged to which person. This dissolution of individual identity into a collective of ancestors was not an accident of careless deposition. It appears to have been intentional, and it speaks to a conception of death and ancestry that is quite different from the one most of us are familiar with. The dead in the chamber were not separate people. They were the ancestors, undivided, a communal presence to which the living could return. And return they did. The evidence from multiple long barrows suggests that the chambers were not sealed permanently after construction, but were reopened and accessed repeatedly across the monument's period of use. New bones were added, existing bones were moved and rearranged, objects were placed in the chambers, including pottery vessels and the bones of animals and, in some cases, artifacts whose significance we cannot now interpret. Fires were lit in the forecourt, the open area defined by the widened and sometimes revetted earth banks at the broader end of the mound, and the evidence of feasting and ceremony in these forecourts suggests that the long barrows were not passive repositories for the dead, but active social spaces where the living gathered in the presence of the ancestral community and conducted the ceremonies that sustained the relationship between them. The construction of a long barrow was itself a major communal undertaking, requiring resources and organization that went well beyond what any single family or small household group could provide. Before the mound could be raised, the ground had to be prepared, often with the stripping of turf and the lighting of fires on the exposed subsoil. The stones for the chamber, where stone was used, had to be quarried or gathered and transported, sometimes over considerable distances, and then erected, moving and lifting the massive capstones that form the roofs of the stone-built chambers. Stones that in some cases weigh many tons, required engineering knowledge and coordinated human labor on a scale that implies social organization reaching across multiple communities. The earth for the mound itself had to be dug and carried and piled. The whole project, for the larger examples, would have required many months of sustained effort by a community of substantial size. That community was investing its surplus time and energy in the dead, and that investment tells us more about what the dead meant to the living in Neolithic Britain than any other single piece of evidence. The long barrows are not all the same, and the differences between them are informative. Some are very long and contain multiple chambers with many individuals. Others are short and contain a single chamber with few remains. Some appear to have been used intensively over many generations and then sealed. Others show evidence of only brief use before they were closed. The variation suggests that these monuments were not built to a single template imposed from above, but were instead the product of local decisions made by individual communities about how to express and enact the relationship between the living and the dead that was the common thread connecting all of them. The tradition was shared. The expression of it was local, personal, and particular. If the long barrows were the permanent homes of the ancestral dead, the causewayed enclosures were something complementary and different. The gathering places of the living. They are the most geographically widespread of the early Neolithic monument types in Britain, and they have been debated and reinterpreted across the span of a century of archaeological investigation, without the debate ever reaching a settled conclusion. What is clear is that they were significant, that they required the mobilization of enormous collective labor to build, and that the activities conducted within and around them were varied and complex, touching on every aspect of Neolithic social life. A causewayed enclosure consists of one or more, roughly circular or oval ditches, interrupted at regular intervals by sections of unexcavated ground. These interruptions, the causeways that give the monument type its name, are the defining characteristic of the form, and they distinguish causewayed enclosures immediately from simple defensive ditches or stock enclosures. The breaks in the ditch circuit are too frequent and too regularly spaced to be accidental or structural necessities. They appear to be deliberate features, and the most persuasive explanation for them is that they were meaningful, marking the points at which different groups or communities entered the enclosed space from different directions, perhaps maintaining a symbolic or territorial distinction, even within the shared space of the enclosure, perhaps representing a way of organizing the gathering so that different communities had their own defined places within the larger whole. The largest and most extensively investigated of these monuments is Windmill Hill, which occupies a chalk ridge northwest of the later Avebury Henge in Wiltshire and was in use from around 3700 BCE. It consists of 3 concentric rings of interrupted ditches enclosing an area of approximately 8.5 hectares, and within and around these ditches, archaeologists, working across many decades, have found one of the richest assemblages of early Neolithic material from anywhere in Britain. The pottery from the ditches runs to thousands of sherds, representing many hundreds of individual vessels, and the distribution and condition of these sherds suggests that many of the vessels were deliberately smashed and deposited in the ditches, rather than simply discarded after breaking accidentally. The breaking of pottery as a ritual act, the deliberate destruction of a vessel as a way of marking a moment or completing a ceremony, is a practice documented in many cultures around the world, and the evidence from Windmill Hill and other causewayed enclosures is consistent with this interpretation. The animal bones from Windmill Hill are dominated by cattle, and they occur in quantities and in distributions within the ditches that are consistent with feasting. Large numbers of animals slaughtered and consumed at the same time, with the bones then deposited in the ditches as part of the formal ending of the event. The scale of the feasting implied by some of these deposits is enormous, requiring the gathering of animals and people from across a wide area and the organization of logistics that went well beyond what any single community could manage. The causewayed enclosures were gathering places for communities spread across the broader landscape, and the feast that was conducted within them was a social event as much as a culinary one, an occasion for the negotiation of relationships, the exchange of gifts, the arrangement of marriages, the resolution of disputes, and all the other business that requires face-to-face contact between people who for much of the year live too far apart to see each other. The human remains found in the ditch deposits at causewayed enclosures add complexity and some darkness to the picture. Human bones appear at many sites, and they occur in a variety of conditions and arrangements that resist simple interpretation. Some appear to represent deliberate deposits of individual bones or partial skeletons, perhaps portions of ancestors removed from long barrows and brought to the enclosure for use in ceremony. At Hambledon Hill in Dorset, where one of the most extensive excavations of any causewayed enclosure has taken place, the evidence includes skulls placed in the ditches in ways that appear deliberate and meaningful, and the site also shows evidence of violent conflict, arrowheads embedded in human bone, indications that the enclosure's banks and palisades were burned. Whatever social negotiations were supposed to happen at Hambledon Hill, they sometimes failed, and the failure was violent. Among all the monument types of Neolithic Britain, the Cursus monuments are the least known outside the world of specialist archaeology, and in some ways, the most genuinely mysterious. They are everywhere in the British landscape once you have learned to look for them, but they are almost entirely invisible at ground level in most cases, surviving now only as the faintest traces. Crop marks visible from the air in dry summers, when the parched grass above the filled-in ditch reveals the outline of the buried feature in a slightly different shade of yellow from the surrounding field. Occasional earthwork, remnants on uncultivated ground. Subtle variations in the surface of the land that you might notice if you were paying close attention, but that most people walk across without registering. They are long, the Cursus monuments. This is the quality that defines them and that becomes, when you look at the plans and consider the practicalities, genuinely difficult to account for in any simple functional explanation. The Stonehenge Cursus, which runs across the chalk downland, just north of Stonehenge itself, extends for nearly 3 kilometres. The Dorset Cursus, which crosses the chalk uplands of Cranbourne Chase, extends for 10 kilometres, making it the longest Neolithic monument in Britain and one of the longest prehistoric linear monuments anywhere in the world. Both consist of the same basic form: two parallel ditches with internal banks, running across the landscape in a roughly straight line and closing at each end in a ditch that completes the rectangle. The interior of the enclosure thus defined is long and narrow, a corridor through the landscape, bounded on both sides and closed at both ends, but open to the sky above. The Antiquary. William Stukeley, who first described and named the Stonehenge Cursus in the early 18th century, assumed from its form that it must be a Roman racetrack and named it accordingly from the Latin word for a running course. He was almost certainly wrong about the Romans and probably wrong about the racing, but the name stuck, and the monument type has been called the Cursus ever since. What it was actually used for is a question that researchers have been turning over without arriving at a definitive answer for as long as the monuments have been studied systematically. The most compelling interpretive framework for the Cursus monuments involves the idea of movement through the landscape as ritual act. The idea that the long, straight enclosed spaces were designed to direct people, to channel them along a specific route through the landscape, perhaps as part of funerary processions, perhaps as part of ceremonies marking the passage of the seasons, perhaps as the physical enactment of journeys that held cosmological or spiritual significance for the communities that built and used them. Many Cursus monuments are aligned in ways that have potential astronomical significance, oriented toward the rising or setting of the sun at the solstices or equinoxes, or toward significant points on the lunar cycle. The relationship between Cursus orientation and astronomical events is not always precise enough to be entirely compelling, but it recurs across enough sites to suggest that the builders were considering the movement of celestial bodies when they set out the direction of their monuments. The association of Cursus monuments with funerary sites is documented at multiple locations. The Stonehenge Cursus terminates at its eastern end, close to a long barrow, and there are long barrows within the body of the Dorset Cursus, incorporated into its alignment as if they were waypoints on a journey. The scale of labour required to build the longer Cursus monuments is immense by any standard. The Dorset Cursus, 10 kilometres long, with ditches running on both sides, represents tens of thousands of hours of digging through chalk with antler picks and bone shovels. Organising and sustaining the labour force required to build a monument of that scale implies a level of social organisation that goes well beyond the capacity of any single community, and the monument that results from that effort is, by the simple fact of its scale, a declaration of the collective capacity of multiple communities working in concert. Far to the north, on a cluster of islands at the northern tip of Scotland, beaten by the winds of the Atlantic and the North Sea, the Neolithic people of Britain built another world entirely. The Orkney Islands today are extraordinary in their landscape. Low, windswept, intensely green in summer, surrounded by some of the most turbulent and dangerous waters in the Northern Hemisphere, with a quality of light that shifts from moment to moment as the clouds move in off the sea and the sun breaks through at unexpected angles across the flat farmland and the loch shores. In the Neolithic, Orkney was home to one of the most remarkable concentrations of prehistoric monuments anywhere in the world, and some of those monuments survive in a state of preservation that no chalkland site in southern England can match. Skara Brae is the most famous of the Orkney Neolithic monuments, and it has a strong claim to being one of the most extraordinary archaeological sites in all of Europe. It is a village, a cluster of stone-built houses connected by covered passages, buried in the sand of the dune system at the Bay of Skell on the western coast of Orkney mainland. The houses were buried and preserved by wind-blown sand for approximately 4,500 years. From the time the village was abandoned around 2500 BCE until a ferocious winter storm in 1850 stripped the sand away from the ruins and revealed the walls standing to close to their original height. The preservation is extraordinary in a way that nothing in the chalk landscapes of the south can match, because the Orcadian sandstone builds walls that endure, and because the sand protected those walls from the weathering that has reduced every comparable site in the rest of Britain to foundations and post holes and the ghost outlines of things that were once real rooms with real walls. The stone furniture inside the houses is still in place. The stone shelving units built against the back wall of each house where containers and tools and valued objects would have been stored and displayed are still standing. The stone hearth in the center of the floor, where the fire burned and the food was cooked, and the family gathered in the long dark Orcadian evenings, is still clearly defined. The stone box beds built into the side walls, framed by slabs set on edge and presumably filled with heather or bracken or the fleeces of sheep, are still there, still organized around the same central hearth, still oriented toward the door in the same way in house after house. You can stand in the doorway of one of these houses and look in at the furniture that was last arranged by someone who lived here 5,000 years ago, and the domestic familiarity of what you see, the clear evidence of people organizing their space in ways that any of us would recognize, is one of the most powerful experiences that the ancient world of Britain makes available to any visitor. The village at Salisbury was home to a community of perhaps 50 to 100 people, living in houses of broadly similar size and layout, suggesting a relatively egalitarian social structure, without the sharp distinctions between elite and common households that appear in later prehistoric settlements. The houses are interconnected by a network of low stone-roofed passages that would have allowed movement between them without going out into the Orcadian weather, which is significant in itself as a social fact. The community of Salisbury was not a collection of isolated family units. It was a genuinely interconnected community, sharing space and presumably much else, organized in ways that required daily cooperation and created an intimacy between its members that is reflected in the shared architecture of the passages and the interlinked houses. The material culture found at Salisbury is extraordinarily rich for a Neolithic site. The pottery belongs to the grooved ware tradition, the highly decorated style with its geometric patterns incised or applied to the clay surface, that originated in Orkney and spread southward across Britain with remarkable speed and thoroughness in the later Neolithic period. The presence of grooved ware at sites as far south as Stonehenge itself is one of the most compelling pieces of evidence for the intensity of the connections that linked the communities of Neolithic Britain across the full length of the island. Ideas were flowing from Orkney southward, or people were, or both, and the direction of that flow is itself significant. In the story of Neolithic Britain, the islands at the far north were not a peripheral backwater receiving influence from the more populated south. They were, in some respects, a centre of innovation and influence from which things spread. Salisbury sits within a broader monumental landscape on Orkney that is, on its own terms, as ambitious and as sophisticated as anything in the southern chalk. The Ring of Brodgar is a stone circle of enormous proportions, with an original count of perhaps 60 standing stones, arranged in a perfect circle, 104 meters in diameter, surrounded by a ditch cut into the bedrock, with a precision and regularity that required careful surveying and skilled execution over a sustained period. The Stones of Stennis, nearby, is another stone circle, smaller but older, and the stones that remain standing are among the tallest of any Neolithic stone monument in Britain, reaching nearly 6 meters above the ground surface. Between these two circles, a causeway crosses the narrows of the isthmus that separates the locks of Harré and Stennes. And this geography, the placement of the monuments between two bodies of water on a slender neck of land, seems to have been deliberately chosen, a positioning of the sacred architecture at a threshold, between water and water, between different zones of the world. The Maes Hau chambered cairn, within sight of both stone circles, is the finest Neolithic chambered tomb in all of Britain, a monument whose construction reflects a level of architectural skill and planning that commands respect across the millennia. The central chamber, reached by a passage nearly 11 meters long, is aligned precisely with the midwinter sunset, so that the setting sun on the days around the winter solstice shines directly down the passage and illuminates the back wall of the chamber for a period of several days around the shortest day of the year. The alignment is too accurate to be accidental, and its significance is perhaps the clearest and most moving expression anywhere in Britain of the Neolithic understanding of the cycle of death and renewal. The connection between the moment of minimum sunlight, the darkness of the chamber where the dead rested, and the beginning of the sun's return toward the light of spring. The Avebury complex in North Wiltshire is the largest prehistoric stone monument in Britain and one of the most significant prehistoric sites in all of Europe, and yet it receives a fraction of the attention given to Stonehenge, which is smaller and less complex, but more immediately comprehensible in a single view. Avebury's challenge, from the point of view of public recognition, is precisely its scale. The monument is so large and so embedded in the modern landscape with its village and its roads and its encircling fields that it is genuinely difficult to perceive as a whole from any single viewpoint. You have to hold it in the mind as a map rather than as a visual experience, because no single vantage point allows you to see all of it at once. But held in the mind as a map, and understood in the context of the monumental landscape that surrounds it for miles in every direction, it is extraordinary. At the centre of the complex is the Great Henge, a roughly circular bank and ditch, the ditch cut into the chalk to a depth of over 9 meters in places and reaching in its excavated profile the shape of an enormous canyon, encloses an area of approximately 11.5 hectares. The bank formed from the chalk, spoil of the ditch, originally rose to perhaps 5 or 6 meters above the surrounding ground surface, creating a visual barrier that would have made the interior of the monument effectively invisible from outside when seen from ground level. Within the enclosure, the stone circles, the great outer ring of over 90 Sarsen megaliths, originally standing at intervals around the inner edge of the ditch, and 2 smaller inner circles whose stones are mostly fallen or removed, but whose positions have been identified through patient excavation and the reading of the subtle changes in the chalk that the stone holes have left behind. Avenues of paired standing stones extended outward from 2 of the 4 entrances through the henge, leading the eye and presumably the feet of participants outward into the surrounding landscape. The Sarsens at Avebury have not been shaped or dressed. They were selected from the natural Sarsen fieldstone that occurs on the Marlborough Downs to the east and north, chosen for their size and for their individual form, because the original builders seem to have deliberately alternated between tall, narrow pillars and broad lozenge-shaped stones around the outer ring in a pattern that may have had symbolic significance, perhaps representing a distinction between male and female, or between different aspects of the powers the monument was intended to address. They were dragged to their positions by organized human labor, without any mechanical advantage beyond the use of ropes and timber rollers and levers and the coordinated force of many people, working together over extended periods. The largest stones at Avebury weigh in excess of 60 tons. Beyond the henge itself, the Avebury landscape contains a density of prehistoric features that is unmatched anywhere else in Britain. West Kennet Long Barrow sits on a chalk ridge, a mile and a half to the south. Silbury Hill, the enormous artificial mound rising 30 meters from the valley floor and covering an area of over 2 hectares at its base, stands within sight of the henge. Despite more than 2 centuries of investigation, including multiple tunneling operations that have explored its interior, the purpose of Silbury Hill remains unknown. It is not a burial mound in any straightforward sense. No burial has been found within it, though the mound was clearly built deliberately and in stages over what appears to have been an extended period of construction. It is simply the largest Neolithic earthwork in Europe, and it stands in the landscape as the most eloquent possible testament to the ambition and the organizational capacity of the people who built it, and to our enduring inability to fully understand what they were doing. The people who built all of this were, in genetic terms, a relatively homogeneous population across most of Britain for most of the Neolithic period. They shared the ancestry of the early European farmers, the lineage that had spread westward from Anatolia across Europe over several millennia, and within Britain, this ancestry showed relatively little regional differentiation. The people of Orkney and the people of Wiltshire were not genetically identical, but they were much more similar to each other than their geographical separation might lead us to expect, and the similarity reflects the reality of the connections and movements that the grooved ware pottery distribution and the other material evidence also speaks to. People were moving across the length of Britain, carrying ideas and objects and presumably relationships throughout the Neolithic period. The isotope chemistry of Neolithic bones and teeth, analyzed at increasing numbers of sites in recent years, has revealed that movement of individuals across the landscape was common. The strontium isotope ratio preserved in the teeth of an individual during childhood reflects the geology of the water and food they consumed in those early years, and it is geologically specific enough that researchers can often identify, within broad limits, where a person grew up. When the tooth strontium is compared to the bone strontium of the same individual, which reflects the geology of their later adult environment, it is sometimes possible to identify people who moved during their lives from one geological zone to another. These studies have found, at multiple sites across Neolithic Britain, individuals who grew up in one part of the country and died in another, sometimes hundreds of miles from their childhood home. A person buried in the monuments of the Avebury landscape may have grown up in Wales or in the north of England. The mobility of Neolithic Britons was greater than the static impression given by the permanent monuments might suggest. The question of how Neolithic society was organized, of how decisions were made about who led and who followed, who directed the enormous labor projects that produced the monuments, is one that the archaeological evidence addresses only obliquely. There is no clear evidence for a small hereditary elite of the kind that later Bronze Age societies in Britain would develop, with wealthy individuals distinguished from commoners by the richness of their grave goods and the scale of their burial monuments. The Long Barrow dead are a communal deposit, not an individualized elite. The goods placed with them are ordinary objects, tools, and pottery of the kind used in daily life. Whether this reflects a genuinely egalitarian social structure, or simply a cultural preference for the expression of communal rather than individual identity in mortuary practice, is a question that cannot be definitively answered. One of the most revealing aspects of the Neolithic archaeology of Britain is what it tells us about connections between communities separated by considerable distances. The movement of materials across the landscape and across the sea in the Neolithic reached a scale and a regularity that speaks clearly to active and sustained exchange networks, not to isolated communities making do with what their immediate environment could provide. The stone axes are the most dramatic evidence for this. Stone axes were the primary, heavy-duty tools of the early Neolithic, used for felling trees and clearing land, for working timber, for whatever other purposes heavy implements serve in a farming community. They were made from various stone types depending on what was locally available, but the distribution of finished axes across Britain does not simply mirror the distribution of suitable stone. Axes made from specific stone types found their way, in large numbers, to areas very far from where that stone occurs naturally. The reasons were not always primarily practical. Many axes were clearly valued as objects in themselves, as things worth having, for reasons that went beyond their functional utility. The quarry sites at Great Langdale in the Lake District of Cumbria are among the most extraordinary places in Neolithic Britain, and the fact that they are not more widely known outside archaeological circles says something about how incompletely the full story of prehistoric Britain has been communicated to the wider public. High on the slopes of the Langdale Pikes, at altitudes where the weather is frequently severe and the terrain is challenging by any standard, the distinctive green volcanic tuff that outcrops at this location was being quarried and shaped into axes throughout the Neolithic period. The quarrying evidence survives in the form of large quantities of flaking debris and roughed-out axe blanks that accumulate on the steep scree slopes below the outcrops. The waste of many thousands of hours of skilled knapping work conducted at altitude in conditions that were never comfortable. The finished axes made from this material, with their characteristic greenish-grey colour and fine texture, have been found at sites across the entire British Isles, from Cornwall to the Orkney Islands, from the east coast of England to the western coasts of Wales and Ireland. Someone was travelling to the mountains of the Lake District in a quantity and with a regularity that sustained a substantial production industry, and the axes they brought back were moving through exchange networks that covered the whole of Britain. The pottery evidence for long-distance connection is equally striking. Grooved ware pottery, that distinctive and elaborately decorated style with its geometric designs, originated in Orkney and spread southward through Britain with a speed and completeness that implies not merely the adoption of a pottery fashion by admiring neighbours, but the movement of people, or the operation of intense social connections that carried the idea, the technique, and perhaps the vessels themselves across hundreds of miles. From Orkney to Stonehenge is a very long way, and yet the pottery of the same tradition appears at both ends of that journey. The sea lanes around Britain were not empty in the Neolithic. They were highways, and the people who used them were navigating open water with skill and confidence, maintaining connections across the surrounding seas that required both the technology and the sustained social relationships to support. Around 2,500 years before the Common Era, the pattern of British prehistory shifted again, and shifted profoundly. A new population arrived in Britain, crossing the Channel in boats and moving on to the chalk downlands and the river valleys of the south and east, bringing with them a material culture and a set of burial practices and a genetic ancestry that were entirely unlike those of the Neolithic population they were joining and eventually replacing. These were the Bell-Beaker people, named for the distinctive inverted bell-shaped pottery vessels that are so closely associated with their culture across a vast swathe of Western and Central Europe, and their impact on Britain was, in demographic terms, the most dramatic in the island's entire prehistoric history. The Bell-Beaker phenomenon spread across Europe in the centuries around 2500 BCE with a speed and geographical extent that puzzled archaeologists for generations. From its probable origins in the Iberian Peninsula, Bell-Beaker pottery and the associated material culture spread east, north, and west across Europe within a few centuries. Whether this spread reflected the movement of people or merely the adoption of a package of ideas and objects by populations already in place, was debated for a long time, and the ancient DNA evidence has now provided a clear answer. In Western and Central Europe, the Bell-Beaker spread was associated with population movement, with people physically relocating in large numbers and substantially displacing existing populations. In Britain, This displacement reached its most extreme expression. Within 2 or 3 centuries of the first Bell Beaker groups arriving, the Neolithic population that had been here for 1500 years had been replaced, genetically, to a degree of more than 90%. The new population carried a distinctive ancestry, a mixture of early European farmer ancestry combined with a substantial proportion of ancestry from the Pontic steppe, the grasslands north and east of the Black Sea, from which expanding populations had already been sweeping westward across continental Europe for 2 or 3 centuries before their descendants reached Britain. The Bell Beaker people brought with them a new conception of individuality in death. Where the Neolithic dead had been incorporated into collective monuments, their bones mixed with those of their community, their individual identities dissolved into the ancestral mass. The Bell Beaker burial rite emphasized the singular person. Single graves, each containing one individual, placed in a crouched position in a pit or under a small round barrow, accompanied by a specific and consistent set of objects. The beaker, often placed near the head, copper or bronze tools, daggers and awls, stone wrist guards for protecting the forearm from the snap of a bowstring, arrowheads, the equipment of an archer and a warrior, sometimes of a metalworker, always of an individual whose personal identity and personal equipment were worth commemorating separately from everyone else. The collective was giving way to the individual, and the landscape of monuments was beginning to change to reflect that shift. The Amesbury archer, discovered in 2002 near Amesbury in Wiltshire, is perhaps the most celebrated Bell Beaker individual yet found in Britain. He was a man in his 40s, buried with more objects than any other Bell Beaker individual found in Britain. 5 beakers, 23 arrowheads, 2 stone wrist guards, 3 copper knives, a pair of gold hair ornaments among the earliest gold objects found in the British Isles, and a range of other tools and personal items. The isotope analysis of his teeth showed that he grew up not in Britain, but in the Alpine region of Central Europe, most probably in what is now Switzerland or southern Germany or Austria. He crossed the Channel in his own lifetime, came to live near Stonehenge, died near Stonehenge, and was buried there with extraordinary honour. Why he came, what drew him specifically to the Salisbury Plain, is something we cannot know. But that he came, that he was valued, that he was buried with the wealth of a community that regarded him as significant, speaks to the connections between Britain and the continent in this period as nothing else does. The Bell Beaker people engaged with the existing monumental landscape of Britain in complex and respectful ways. They did not ignore the Neolithic monuments or treat them as irrelevant. Many of the great henges continued to be used and modified in the Bell Beaker period and the early Bronze Age. The final major phase of Stonehenge construction, the raising of the great trilithons in the arrangement we recognize today, was carried out by the Bell Beaker people and their immediate descendants. They inherited a landscape saturated with accumulated meaning, and they built within it and upon it, adding their own understanding to a place that had been sacred for a very long time before them. And then there is the question of what was lost, which is perhaps the most important question of all, and the one that the archaeological evidence is least equipped to answer. What was lost when the Mesolithic people were replaced by the Neolithic farmers? What was lost when the Neolithic people were replaced by the Bell Beaker arrivals? What was lost in each of those demographic upheavals, those sweeping replacements of one population by another, that left so little trace of the replaced in the replacing? Language was lost. The Mesolithic people of Britain spoke one or more languages of which nothing survives. Not a word, not a name, not a phrase. Those languages were not written, not recorded, not preserved in any form that has reached us. The words they used for the rivers and the hills and the specific places that mattered to them, the terms they had for the plants and animals of the wildwood, the names they gave to each other and to the powers they believed governed the world, All of it is gone, as completely as if it had never existed. Which it did. It existed in the mouths and minds of many thousands of people, across thousands of years. And then it stopped. The Neolithic farmers who replaced the Mesolithic population also spoke languages that left no trace. Pre-Indo-European languages, probably related to the Anatolian farmer languages, whose last surviving descendant in highly modified form may be the Basque language of northern Spain and southern France, but in Britain entirely erased by the time any writing reached the island. And the Bell Beaker people introduced, in all probability, an early form of an Indo-European language, ancestral to the later Celtic languages of the British Isles, but even that ancestor language left no direct textual record. We are deep in the silence before writing, and that silence is absolute on the question of what people said to each other, what they believed, what they feared, what they hoped for. Knowledge was lost. The Mesolithic people had accumulated over thousands of years a detailed and practically sophisticated understanding of the British landscape, of its plants and animals and seasons and ecological relationships, that was held entirely in memory and transmitted entirely through practice and teaching. Much of this knowledge would have been specific and irreplaceable. Which particular varieties of plant could be used to treat specific ailments, which rivers carried fish in which seasons, which combinations of materials produced the most effective adhesives for hafting flint tools, how to read the sky and the movement of animals and the behavior of the wind to predict what the next days would bring. When the Mesolithic population was demographically overwhelmed, much of this knowledge went with them. Some was perhaps absorbed by the incoming farmers through the contact between populations that the genetics shows was real if limited. But the systematic, accumulated, intergenerational knowledge of how to live in the British wildwood without clearing or farming it, that knowledge, built up over more than 5,000 years of continuous habitation, was gone within a few generations of the wildwood beginning to be felled. Belief was lost. Whatever the Mesolithic people believed about the nature of the world, about the relationship between the living and the dead, about the powers that governed the seasons and the animals and the weather, about what lay beyond death, none of it was ever written down, and the material culture they left behind is too sparse and too subject to multiple interpretations to allow confident reconstruction. The Neolithic beliefs, the cosmology and the ritual practice and the relationship with the ancestral dead that the long barrows and the henges embody are also lost in any detailed sense, though the monuments give us more to work with. And the Bell Beaker beliefs, the things people believed who buried their dead as individuals with archery equipment and fine pottery and gold ornaments, are also beyond recovery in any specific form. 3 full systems of belief, each the product of centuries of development and refinement and the accumulated spiritual experience of many generations of people, gone without leaving a word of explanation behind them. What survives is stone and earth and occasionally the preserved remains of the dead, and the careful, patient work of all the researchers across all the generations who have looked at these things and thought hard about what they might mean. What survives is enough to know that the 5,000 years before Stonehenge were not empty or silent or waiting for history to begin. They were full of people, living full lives, in a landscape they knew and shaped and built upon, and were shaped by in turn. Across a span of time so vast that the whole of recorded human history, from the invention of writing to the present day, would fit within it and leave room to spare. These were not simple people, not primitive people, not people who were merely the precursors to something more important that came later. They were fully realized human beings, living fully realized human lives in a world that they understood far better than we understand our own. The material world of the Mesolithic hunter-gatherers was richer and more varied than the popular image of Stone Age people usually suggests, and understanding it is essential to understanding the people themselves, because the tools a culture makes and the materials it uses are a direct expression of its priorities and its intelligence. The Mesolithic toolkit was not a simple collection of roughly shaped stones. It was a sophisticated, multi-material system of tools and weapons and containers and clothing and structural materials, assembled from everything that the British wildwood and its rivers and coasts provided, and designed with an attention to function and efficiency that reflects tens of thousands of years of iterative development and refinement. Flint was the foundation of the toolkit, because flint is available in quantity in the chalk landscapes of southern and eastern Britain, and because, among the naturally occurring materials available to a Stone Age craftsperson, it is uniquely well suited to the production of sharp edges. A freshly knapped flint edge is, by some measures, sharper than the finest surgical steel. It cuts at the molecular level, producing an edge that is thinner than any metal blade can be made without breaking. The Mesolithic people, who worked flint, knew its properties intimately. They knew which nodules would knap cleanly and which would shatter unpredictably. They knew how to read the grain and the inclusions of the flint, to predict how it would behave under the pressure of the antler billet they struck it with. And they knew the sequence of strikes and pressures that would produce the specific forms they needed from a given piece of raw material. This knowledge was not instinctive. It was learned, practiced, refined over years of apprenticeship, and it produced, in the hands of an expert, results that modern knappers, with all their theoretical knowledge, still find difficult to replicate. But flint and other stone was only the hard edge of the toolkit. The tools that flint blades and points were set into were made of wood and bone and antler, materials that required entirely different working techniques and that expressed entirely different aspects of the Mesolithic craftsperson's skill. The wooden handles and shafts of composite tools, the antler hammer billets used in flint working, the bone needles used to stitch hides and plant fibers into clothing and bags and containers, the fish hooks of bone, the net weights of fired clay or perforated pebble. All of these required skills in working organic materials that were as developed and as technically demanding as the skills of flint knapping, and in some cases more so. A bone needle fine enough to sew the kind of tight stitching that a weatherproof garment requires, made without any metal tools, is a more demanding object to produce than most people realize until they try. Clothing, containers, and structures completed the material world of Mesolithic Britain, and while almost none of these survive in the archaeological record from British sites because of the conditions of preservation, analogies from other parts of the world, and the occasional exceptional site where organic materials have been preserved, give us a clear enough picture of what the range of technologies included. Hides tanned to softness and cut and stitched into garments and boots and bags. Baskets and mats and containers woven from the flexible stems of plants gathered at the wetland edges. From hazel withies, from the long leaf blades of rushes and sedges. Cordage twisted from plant fibers, or from the inner bark of trees, or from the sinew of large animals. Used for bowstrings and fishing lines, and the lashings that held composite tools together, and the ropes that formed the frames of temporary shelters. The Mesolithic people of Britain were not naked or unequipped or primitive in any sense that the word honestly implies. They were technologically sophisticated in the ways that mattered for the lives they lived, and the sophistication of their technology was a direct product of the sophistication of their understandings of the natural world they lived in. The question of how the Neolithic people of Britain organized their time is one that the monuments themselves, read carefully, help us begin to answer. The alignments of the monuments with the movements of the sun and the moon and the stars are not incidental features or accidental correspondences. They are deliberate and precise, and they reveal something fundamental about how the Neolithic mind understood the relationship between the human world and the celestial world above it. Time, for the Neolithic people of Britain, was not the abstract, uniform medium that the modern clock produces. It was a quality of specific moments, moments when the sun stood at its northernmost or southernmost rising point on the horizon, moments when the full moon rose in a particular position, moments when certain stars appeared above the skyline for the first time after months of absence. These moments were meaningful because they organized the year into a structure that could be anticipated and prepared for and marked with appropriate ceremony, and the monuments were, among other things, instruments for the precise identification and celebration of those moments. The alignment of Maes Howe in Orkney with the midwinter sunset is the most precisely documented of these solar orientations, but it is far from the only one. The main axis of Stonehenge is oriented toward the midsummer sunrise and, in the opposite direction, toward the midwinter sunset, so that a person standing at the center of the monument at the right moment on either of the solstice days would see the sun appear to rise or set in perfect alignment with the principal axis of the stones. Long barrows across southern Britain show a tendency to be oriented with their wider, forecourt end toward the eastern half of the horizon, toward the rising sun, in a pattern that is too consistent across too many sites to be random. The Cursus monuments, as we have noted, frequently show astronomical orientations in their long axes. The megalithic monuments of Britain, taken as a whole, constitute a landscape-scale calendar, a distributed network of stone pointers that mark the significant moments of the solar and lunar year in ways that were visible to any community member present at the right location at the right time. The ritual year that these monuments helped to organize was almost certainly structured around the major transitions of the agricultural and pastoral calendar, as much as around the astronomical events that marked them. The beginning of spring, when the livestock began to give birth and the first planting could begin, was a moment of enormous practical significance and presumably of enormous ceremonial significance too. The summer solstice, the longest day, the peak of solar power, demanded acknowledgement. The autumn harvest, the time when the year's agricultural work reached its conclusion and the community knew whether it had enough stored food to survive the winter, was another pivot point around which ceremony and social gathering would naturally concentrate. The midwinter solstice, the darkest moment, the point at which the sun's retreat was finally reversed and the long, slow return toward warmth and light began, was perhaps the most charged of all these moments, the one that the builders of Maes Howe and, very likely, the builders of Stonehenge in its various phases chose to mark with their most precise and ambitious astronomical architecture. Around these fixed moments in the solar and lunar calendar, the social life of Neolithic Britain organized itself. The causewayed enclosures were almost certainly used seasonally rather than continuously, gathering people from across the surrounding landscape at specific times of year for the combined purposes of ceremony and social exchange that required the physical assembly of the community. The long barrows may have been particularly visited, and their deposits particularly reorganized at the moments of greatest ceremonial significance, when the community needed to present itself to the ancestral dead and renew the relationship between the living and all those who had come before. The building of the great monuments itself was most likely carried out during the seasons when agricultural labor was lightest, when the community had time and energy to divert from the daily necessities of food production into the enormous collective projects that the monuments required. The whole Neolithic year was a cycle of work and ceremony and social gathering and rest, patterned by the movements of the sun and the moon and the rhythms of the agricultural seasons. And the monuments were its markers, its instruments, and its most enduring legacy. The river valleys of Neolithic Britain were as important to the communities that lived in them as the chalk uplands where the most visible monuments stand, and in some respects more so, because rivers were the arteries of the Neolithic world, the routes along which people and goods and ideas moved across the landscape, the sources of the fresh water that every farming community required, Their habitats that concentrated food resources across the year in ways that made them attractive places to settle near and to return to. The great river systems of southern Britain, the Thames and the Avon and the Kennet and the Wylye and the Great Ouse, ran through landscapes that were in the Neolithic quite different from what they are today. Wider, shallower in many places, bordered by extensive reed beds and osier beds and wet meadow that flooded seasonally and that supported populations of birds and fish and beaver and otter and the plant communities of the floodplain in their full variety. It was along the rivers and their valleys that the communities of Neolithic Britain moved most freely and most frequently. A journey along a river is a journey with a guaranteed water supply, with a clear route that does not require the navigation of difficult terrain, and with the possibility of using a boat for at least some of the distance. The distribution of Neolithic monuments in Britain is not random with respect to the river systems. The great monument complexes at Avebury and Stonehenge both sit within a short distance of the River Avon, and the avenue that connects Stonehenge to the river was almost certainly a route along which people, and perhaps the stones themselves, travelled during the monument's construction and use. The monument landscape of the Upper Thames Valley, with its extraordinary concentration of cursus monuments and henges and long barrows, follows the valley bottom and its margins for many miles. In Orkney, the monuments cluster around the locks and the tidal sounds of the island group, using the water as a unifying medium rather than a barrier. Wherever you look in the distribution of Neolithic monuments, the water is never far away. The wetlands at the margins of the rivers and the fens were not wastelands or obstacles to be crossed and left behind. They were, for the Neolithic and Mesolithic communities that understood how to use them, extraordinarily productive landscapes. The Somerset Levels, the broad flat wetland basin of central Somerset that extends inland from the Bristol Channel, were already being crossed by wooden trackways in the Neolithic period, as communities on the higher ground around the edges of the basin used the wetlands for their resources, for the reed and sedge that made the best thatching and weaving material, for the fish that concentrated in the drains and pools, for the wildfowl that gathered in the reed beds in enormous numbers, for the peat that provided fuel, and for the pigs that could be driven out onto the higher parts of the fen to graze during the summer months. The Somerset Sweet Track, a wooden walkway constructed across the wetland around 3800 BCE, is one of the oldest known engineered roads in the world, and it tells us something important about the Neolithic people of that part of Britain. They were willing to invest substantial labour in infrastructure that made the wetland landscape accessible, and they were organised enough to coordinate and complete a project of that complexity and scale. The coasts of Neolithic Britain were also productive and significant landscapes, and the communities that lived within reach of the sea were not simply land-based farmers who happened to have water nearby. Coastal and estuarine communities collected shellfish from the rocky foreshore and the mudflat, netted fish in the shallower inshore waters, hunted the seal and the occasional stranded whale, gathered seabird eggs from the cliff colonies, and used the sea as a highway for movement in ways that the distribution of coastal monuments and the isotopic evidence from individual burials both confirm. The sea was not a boundary at the edge of the world. It was a medium of connection, and the communities that lived beside it were in some respects the most connected of all. Connected to each other along the coasts, connected across the short sea crossings to Ireland and to the coasts of France and the Low Countries and Scandinavia, connected by the maritime networks that made long-distance exchange possible in ways that land-based movement could not easily replicate. Something was changing in the social and spiritual world of later Neolithic Britain in the centuries before the Belbeca people arrived, and the monuments themselves carry the evidence of that change. The earliest Neolithic, with its collective long barrow burials and its communal causewayed enclosures, and its emphasis on the ancestral dead as a collective, undifferentiated presence, had given way by the late Neolithic to a set of practices and a material culture that began to foreground the individual in ways that the earlier period had not. The great henges, with their controlled access and their enclosing banks that separated the interior from the exterior world, suggest a kind of ceremony from which some people were perhaps excluded, or at least in which different participants had different roles and different relationships to the sacred space. The appearance of particularly rich or unusual individual deposits in some late Neolithic contexts, objects that are more elaborate, more carefully made, more clearly distinguished from the ordinary material of everyday life than anything that appears in the earlier period, begins to suggest that some individuals were accumulating or being accorded a kind of distinction that the collective ethos of the early Neolithic had not recognized. The late Neolithic in Britain, roughly the period from around 3000 to 2500 BCE, saw a series of developments in monument building that reflect this shift without abandoning the collective and cosmological framework that had always been central to the British Neolithic tradition. The great henges, Avebury, Dorrington Walls, the Sanctuary, the Mount Pleasant Henge in Dorset, Marden in the Vale of Pewsey, are products of this period, and they are monuments of a different character from the long barrows and the causewayed enclosures that preceded them. They are not primarily about the dead. They are about the living, about the gathering and the ceremony and the experience of being present within an enclosed and defined sacred space, separated from the ordinary world by the massive banks and deep ditches that constitute the henge boundary. The experience of the henge interior, particularly at a site like Avebury, where the enclosing works are still substantial and where the stones within create a complex of nested spaces and alignments, would have been profoundly different from the experience of the open landscape outside. Dorrington Walls, the enormous henge monument just 2 miles northeast of Stonehenge, was in the late Neolithic the site of what appears to have been one of the largest ceremonial gatherings in prehistoric Britain. The interior of the henge enclosure covers nearly 50 hectares, making it one of the largest Neolithic monuments in Europe by enclosed area, and within and around it, archaeologists have found the debris of feasting on a scale that exceeds even the impressive evidence from Windmill Hill centuries earlier. Thousands of cattle and pig bones, representing animals brought from across a wide area and slaughtered and consumed in events that must have involved very large numbers of people assembled from across the surrounding landscape and beyond. Grooved ware pottery in quantities that suggest the simultaneous use of hundreds of vessels, and evidence of seasonal use, the animal bones suggesting slaughter primarily in the winter months, which implies that the great gathering at Dorrington Walls was a midwinter event, timed to coincide perhaps with the solstice ceremonies that the nearby Stonehenge, with its winter sunset alignment, was also connected to. The relationship between Dorrington Walls and Stonehenge in the late Neolithic is one of the most intensively studied and debated questions in British prehistoric archaeology. The two sites, a large and apparently feasting-centred timber monument and a growing stone monument with strong astronomical alignments, stand within 2 miles of each other and are connected by the River Avon, along which, the current evidence suggests, people may have processed between them on ceremonial occasions. The contrast between the two monuments, the wooden, organic, mutable, feast-associated Dorrington Walls on one hand, and the stone, permanent, cosmologically precise Stonehenge on the other, seems almost too neat to be accidental, and many researchers have proposed that this contrast was itself meaningful, that the two ends of the processional route between the river and Stonehenge represented different aspects of the cycle of life and death, the living and the dead, the mortal and the enduring. Whether or not that specific interpretation is correct, the juxtaposition of these two very different monuments in such close proximity and the evidence of their simultaneous use by communities apparently drawn from across a wide area of southern Britain, speaks to the sophistication and the ambition of the late Neolithic ceremonial landscape of Wiltshire. There is a kind of knowledge that the archaeological record makes available to us, and a kind of knowledge that it permanently withholds, and understanding the difference between these two kinds is important for anyone who wants to think honestly about what British prehistory can tell us. The archaeology gives us things, objects, structures, the chemical residues of ancient substances, the isotopic signatures of ancient food and water, the shape of things buried in the ground. From these things, patient and skilled researchers can derive conclusions about where people lived and what they ate, and how they moved across the landscape, and who they were related to, and how they treated their dead, and what materials they had access to, and how far those materials travelled. This is a remarkable amount of knowledge, and it has grown enormously in the past 2 or 3 decades, as new analytical techniques have extended what the physical evidence can be made to yield. But the archaeology permanently withholds other things, and these withheld things are in many ways the most important ones. It withholds the words, it withholds the music, it withholds the stories and the prayers and the arguments and the jokes and the lullabies and the curses and the names that people called each other in affection or in anger. It withholds the content of the ceremonies it so clearly documents the physical settings for. We can see the monuments, but we cannot hear what was said or sung within them, cannot know what was asked for or given thanks for or lamented. It withholds the emotional texture of the lives it documents in bone and stone, the grief of parents for dead children, the satisfaction of a good harvest, the fear of the unknown, the particular love of a specific person for a specific landscape that they have known all their life. These things were real, because they are always real in human lives, but the archaeological record has no mechanism for preserving them, and they are gone as completely as the words. This is not a failure of archaeology. It is a consequence of the nature of human experience and the materials through which it is expressed. Most of what makes a human life significant is intangible, and intangible things do not fossilize. The grief of the person who placed the last bones in the chamber of the Long Barrow and walked away and never came back was as real and as specific and as crushing as any grief any of us has ever felt, but it is not in the bone record. The joy of the child who watched the great sarsen being moved into position, who had never seen anything so large move, who told the story of that day for the rest of their life. That joy is not in the stone. The terror of the person who stood on the last remaining high ground of Doggerland and watched the water rise toward them for the last time, knowing that the only way out was across the water to whatever lay on the other side. That terror is not in the genetics. What remains is the evidence that these people cared enough about something to build for it. The Long Barrows represent thousands of hours of labor directed toward caring for the dead. The causewayed enclosures represent thousands of hours of labor directed toward the periodic gathering of the community. The stone circles and the henges and the cursus monuments represent, in aggregate, probably millions of hours of collective human effort directed toward purposes that were, to the people who undertook them, as compelling and as non-negotiable as anything in their lives. When you stand in the interior of Avebury, or in the entrance passage of West Kennet Long Barrow, or on the axis of the Stonehenge cursus in the early morning light, you are standing in a space that was made by people who cared deeply about making it. The specific content of what they cared about is beyond recovery. The depth of the caring is written in the stone. There is a population that is almost entirely absent from the conventional narrative of British prehistory, and its absence says something uncomfortable about the limitations of how we typically tell this story. Children, the children of Doggerland, who were taught to read the movement of the fish in the brown rivers of the lowland. The children of the Mesolithic wildwood, who learned to identify the hazelnuts in the August light and to move through the dense understory without making the sounds that frightened the deer. The children of the Neolithic farmers who watched the grain sprout in the cleared fields in spring and helped drive the cattle between the seasonal pastures, and were given small tasks at the edges of the great construction projects that their parents and grandparents directed. Children are largely invisible in the archaeological record of prehistoric Britain, not because they were absent. They were always present, always numerous, always the majority of the population in any pre-modern society with high birth rates and high childhood mortality. But because the evidence for their lives is harder to read than the evidence for adult lives, their bones are smaller and more fragile and decay more quickly in acidic soils. Their tools and toys, if they had dedicated objects of that kind, are indistinguishable, in most cases, from adult tools made at small scale. Their presence at the great ceremonial sites can be inferred from the general social logic of communities in which children went everywhere with the adults, but it is rarely documented directly. Where children do appear in the archaeological record, the evidence is often moving in ways that the record for adults is not, perhaps because we find it easier to feel the weight of childhood across the millennia. The child burials that occur at some Neolithic sites, small individuals placed in the ground with the same care and the same objects as adult burials, speak of communities in which children were mourned as individuals. The cut marks on the deciduous teeth of some Neolithic children, identical to the marks of stone tools on adult bones but applied to the tiny teeth of a child of perhaps 5 or 6 years old, speak of a world in which even the youngest members of the community were not exempt from whatever practices produced those marks. The milk teeth of children recovered from the deposits of some causewayed enclosures, mixed into the ditch fills alongside adult bone and animal remains and broken pottery, speak of places where the dead of all ages were brought and incorporated. The children of Neolithic Britain grew up in a world of enormous physical labor and intimate sensory experience. They grew up in the smell of cattle and wood smoke and fresh-cut chalk and tanning hides. They grew up with the sound of the wind over the open downland and the sound of a stone axe striking sarsen and the sound of the community assembled for ceremony at the causewayed enclosure. They grew up knowing the names of things that we have no access to, the Neolithic names for the plants and the animals and the landscape features and the ceremonies and the stars, the whole vocabulary of a world that has left no text. They carried that world in their bodies and their minds through their lives, and when they died, they took it with them as completely as if it had never existed. The monuments survived, the names did not, but the children also played. This we can infer with certainty, because children have always played, in every culture and in every period for which we have evidence, because play is as fundamental to healthy human development as food and warmth. The children of Neolithic Britain played in the shadow of the great monuments their communities were building, ran across the chalk downland in the summer evenings, swam in the rivers, learned the names of things by asking the adults who knew them, listened to the stories told around the fires in the long winter nights. The stories are gone. The play is gone. The names are gone. But the monuments that were built in their lifetimes and that shaped the landscape of their childhood are still there, still standing in the same fields, still oriented toward the same solstice sunrises, still the most enduring things that human hands have ever made in Britain. The children of Neolithic Britain lived in the presence of those monuments as naturally as we live in the presence of the landscape around us. For them, the long barrows on the ridge and the great henge on the plain were not remarkable. They were simply there, as they had always been, as permanent as the chalk itself. The animals of prehistoric Britain deserve a mention too, not merely as resources exploited by the humans who shared the landscape with them, but as presences in the world that shaped the human experience of that landscape in ways we rarely pause to consider. The sound of a landscape changes when wolves are in it. The behavior of deer changes when lynx are present. The wetlands are different when beavers are engineering them. The forest floor is different when wild boar are rooting through it. The Britain of the Mesolithic and the early Neolithic was a noisier, more dangerous, more alive landscape than anything we can directly experience today in the British Isles, where the megafauna are gone and the apex predators are gone, and the great engineering species, like the beaver, have only recently been tentatively reintroduced in small numbers in a few carefully managed locations. To stand in the wildwood of 10,000 years ago would have been to stand in a world that was far more alert to you than the British countryside of today is. A world in which you were not the apex predator and in which the landscape around you had opinions about your presence. The Mesolithic and Neolithic people who navigated that world did so with a knowledge of its other inhabitants that we have completely lost. A knowledge built from the closest possible attention, sustained across the longest possible time. Stonehenge, when it rose in its final form on the Salisbury Plain, rose into a landscape already ancient with human meaning. The plain on which it stands had been used for ceremony and burial and the gathering of communities for 2,000 years and more before the great Sarsens were raised into their trilithon arrangements. The cursus to the north was already old when the stones were dressed. The long barrows on the surrounding ridges had been receiving their dead for centuries. The avenue that would run from the Henge to the River Avon was already a route of significance along which feet had been walking for generations. Stonehenge was built not to create a sacred landscape, but to deepen one that was already there, to add to it a new kind of permanence. The permanence of stones that would still be standing when everyone who raised them had been dead for 500 years. And yet, Stonehenge is where most people's knowledge of British prehistory begins. The 5,000 years before it are for almost everyone who has not specifically sought them out, a kind of silence. That silence is not an absence of history, it is a failure of transmission, a gap in what has been passed down and taught and made visible in the popular understanding of the past. It is the gap left by the absence of writing, by the overwhelming of so many populations by so many others over so many millennia. Tonight, we have walked into that silence a little way. We have stood on the shores of Doggerland and looked out at the low green country, stretching east and south toward a continent. We have sat in the cave at Cheddar Gorge and tried to see the man whose bones would lie there for 10,000 years. We have held the antler headdresses of the people at Starcar, felt the weight of them, tried to imagine what it was to wear them. We have walked through the wildwood in its full ancient extent, tracked the deer and watched the beavers and gathered the hazelnuts in the long autumn light. We have watched the sea rise and the land diminish and the last visible acres of Doggerland disappear beneath the cold northern water. We have followed the first farmers across the chalk. We have crouched in the chambers of the long barrows with the arranged bones of the communal dead. We have gathered at Windmill Hill in the great seasonal assemblies. We have walked the cursus monuments from end to end. We have stood inside the ring of Brodgar in the Orcadian wind and looked out over the loch. We have looked at the stone furniture in the houses at Skara Brae and recognised, across 5,000 years of separation, the domestic arrangements of people trying to make a home. We have added our footsteps to the West Kennet Avenue, approaching the Great Henge at Avebury. These people built the world that Stonehenge was built into. They are the reason that monument exists where it does, why that plain was chosen, why that landscape was already understood as a place of the dead and the sacred before the first stone was ever raised. They are the foundation, invisible beneath the more famous monument that stands above them in every photograph, but as real and as solid as the chalk beneath the grass. If you have stayed with us this far, thank you for the company. And if sleep found you somewhere in the wildwood, or in the passage of a long barrow, or on the shore of a drowned country as the water came in, that is exactly as it should be. Subscribe to History for Sleep if this is where you want to spend your nights. Every video is its own long journey into something that happened a long time ago to people who deserve to be remembered. Leave a comment if there is a period or a place from the ancient world you would like us to explore. Share this with someone who finds the deep past as fascinating as we do here. And if you want to go further, the extended material, the detailed research discussions, the content that requires more time than a single video allows, everything is on Patreon, linked in the description below. The chalk remembers. The bones are still there in the fields, patiently waiting. Sleep well.